June 4th, 1942. What happened in the skies above the Pacific Ocean that morning would decide the fate of World War II. Yet the men who flew into that storm had no idea they were about to change history forever. The sun had barely risen over the vast waters northwest of Midway Atoll. Below, the Imperial Japanese Navy moved with quiet confidence. 4 of their most powerful aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, cut through the ocean like unstoppable giants. These were not ordinary ships. Just months earlier, they had led the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, they were ready to finish what they started. But hidden far beyond the horizon, a different story was unfolding. Norman "Dusty" Kleiss, a young dive bomber pilot aboard USS Enterprise, stood on the flight deck, preparing for what seemed like just another mission. The tension in the air was thick, but no one fully understood the scale of what lay ahead. The Americans were outnumbered, outgunned, and running on a risky gamble. Their only real advantage was something invisible: information. Thanks to brilliant codebreakers, the United States had uncovered Japan's entire plan. They knew Midway was the target. They knew when the attack would come, and most importantly, they knew where to strike back. Still, knowing wasn't enough. As Kleiss climbed into his SPD Dauntless dive bomber, he felt the familiar mix of fear and determination. The roar of engines filled the deck as one by one aircraft launched into the endless sky. There was no turning back now. Each pilot understood the risk. Many would not return. Far below, Japanese forces were preparing their second wave of attacks. Their decks were crowded with fueled and armed aircraft, ready to launch. It was a moment of vulnerability, but only if someone could find them in time. The early American attacks did not go as planned. Torpedo squadrons, flying slow and outdated planes, charged directly at the enemy carriers. They were met with fierce resistance. Japanese fighter planes tore through them mercilessly. One by one, the American aircraft fell into the sea. Among them was Torpedo Squadron 8, whose sacrifice would later be remembered as one of the bravest moments of the war. But in that chaos, something unexpected happened. The Japanese fighters were drawn down to low altitude, chasing the torpedo planes. Their focus shifted, their guard weakened. High above the clouds, unseen and almost forgotten, Dusty Kleiss and other dive bomber pilots continued searching. Fuel was running low, time was slipping away, doubt began to creep in. Then came a decision, one that would change everything. Commander Wade McCluskey, leading the group, spotted a lone Japanese destroyer speeding across the ocean. It was an unusual sight. Acting on instinct, he chose to follow it. What he found at the end of that trail would lead directly to the heart of the enemy fleet and into one of the most decisive moments in military history. High above the Pacific, the sky stretched endlessly in every direction, but fuel gauges were dropping fast and tension was rising inside every cockpit. Norman "Dusty" Kleiss scanned the horizon, his eyes straining against the glare of the sun reflecting off the ocean below. Nothing. No ships, no smoke, no sign of the enemy they desperately needed to find. Commander Wade McCluskey faced a critical decision. He could turn back now and save what remained of his squadron, or he could press forward into uncertainty and risk losing everything. It was a moment that lasted only seconds, but it carried the weight of the entire war. Trusting instinct over caution, he chose to continue. Then it happened. A thin trail cut across the ocean's surface below, a wake left behind by a fast-moving ship. McCluskey immediately recognized it as a Japanese destroyer. The ship was moving at high speed, clearly trying to rejoin its fleet after chasing down an American submarine earlier.
That single clue was enough. If they followed it, it might lead them straight to the carriers. Kleiss adjusted his course as the formation shifted. Hope returned, but it was fragile. Every minute burned precious fuel. Every second increased the risk of not making it back. Yet none of them turned away. Soon, dark shapes began to emerge on the horizon. At first, they looked like shadows against the water. Then, as the planes drew closer, the truth became unmistakable. The Japanese carrier fleet lay below them, completely exposed. Decks crowded with aircraft, fuel lines running, bombs and torpedoes stacked, ready for launch. It was the perfect and perhaps only moment to strike. But there was a problem. The American dive bombers were not arriving together. Squadrons from different carriers had become separated. Timing was off. Coordination was breaking down. Worse still, Japanese Zero fighters were still circling the skies, though many had been pulled down low chasing the torpedo planes earlier. McCluskey had no choice. He ordered the attack. Kleiss tightened his grip as his aircraft rolled into position. The sky suddenly transformed from calm blue to controlled chaos. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from the ships below, black bursts of smoke filling the air. The carriers began turning sharply, trying to evade the incoming attack. Then Kleiss pushed forward. His dive bomber tipped over into a steep descent, nose pointed directly at the massive carrier below. The wind screamed past his cockpit as the speed increased rapidly. The target grew larger and larger with every passing second. This was the moment every pilot trained for and feared. Through the chaos, Kleiss locked on to his target. He could see men running across the deck. He could see planes being moved. Everything slowed down in his mind, even as the aircraft hurtled downward at terrifying speed. Above and around him, other American dive bombers were diving as well. 3 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were now under sudden, overwhelming attack from the sky. The Japanese had only seconds to react. For Kleiss and the others, there was no turning back now. One precise drop could change everything. One mistake could mean death. And in the next few moments, the course of history would be decided not by fleets or strategies, but by the courage and precision of a handful of pilots falling from the sky.
The sky erupted into chaos as American dive bombers screamed down toward their targets, cutting through clouds and anti-aircraft fire with terrifying surat. For Norman Dusty Kleiss, everything narrowed into a single murhut. Just him, his aircraft, and the massive carrier below. The deck of the Japanese carrier filled his vision. Planes were lined up wing to wing, fully fueled and armed. Crew members ran frantically, some pointing upward, others trying desperately to prepare for impact. The element of surprise had worked. But now came the hardest part, precision. Kleiss steadied his aim. The dauntless dive bomber shuddered under the pressure of its steep descent. The Batas howled past him as gravity pulled the aircraft faster and faster toward the sea. He adjusted slightly, locking on to a nukta near the center of the carrier. Every second mattered. Release too early, and the bomb would miss. Too late, and there would be no escape. Then, at exactly the right moment, he released. The bomb dropped cleanly away from the aircraft. Kleiss immediately pulled back hard on the neutron stick, fighting the heavy G-forces as his plane strained to climb back into the sky. His vision blurred for a split second under the pressure, but he held on. Behind him, the bomb fell true. It slammed into the deck of the carrier Kaga with devastating force. Within moments, a massive explosion tore through the ship. Flames burst upward as fuel and ammunition ignited. The carefully prepared aircraft on deck became instant fireballs. What had been a symbol of Japanese naval dominance was now turning into an uncontrollable inferno.
And Kleiss was not alone. All around him, other dive bombers were striking their targets with deadly accuracy. One after another, bombs crashed into Akagi and Soryu. Each hit triggered chain reactions of explosions, spreading fire rapidly across the carrier's decks and deep into their interior compartments. The Japanese response was desperate. Anti-aircraft guns fired wildly into the sky. Surviving Zero fighters scrambled to climb back up and intercept, but it was too late. The attack had come too suddenly, too precisely. In less than 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's most powerful aircraft carriers were mortally wounded. From above, the Drisya was almost unreal. Columns of thick black smoke rose high into the sky, visible from miles away. Fires raged uncontrollably across the decks. Explosions continued to ripple through the Jahaz as stored bombs and torpedoes detonated one after another. Kleiss leveled his aircraft and took a quick glance back. What he saw was something he would never forget for the rest of his life. The Azim carriers that had once dominated the Pacific were now burning wrecks. The Kuwa that had struck Pearl Harbor was collapsing before his eyes. But the battle was not over yet. Far to the north, one carrier remained untouched, Hiryu. And even as the other carriers burned, Hiryu was already launching its own counterattack. The Americans had delivered a devastating blow, but they were far from safe. The sky would soon fill again with enemy aircraft, and the fight would continue with even greater intensity. For Dusty Kleiss and the surviving pilots, survival was still uncertain. They had struck history, but now they had to escape it.
As Norman Dusty Kleiss pulled his aircraft out of the dive and steadied into level flight, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Below him, 3 Japanese carriers were burning uncontrollably, their decks shattered, their Shakti broken in a matter of minutes. Thick smoke climbed into the sky like dark pillars, marking the Sukkot of an empire's naval Kuwa. But victory was far from complete. Somewhere beyond the smoke and chaos, the 4th carrier, Hiryu, remained operational. Unlike the others, it had avoided the initial strike. Its flight deck was still intact, its aircraft were still armed, and its commanders were already preparing to retaliate. Kleiss and the other American pilots turned back toward their carriers, fuel running dangerously low. The adrenaline that had carried them through the attack was beginning to fade, replaced by exhaustion and uncertainty. Many aircraft were damaged, some pilots were missing. The sky that had moments ago been filled with Humla was now eerily quiet. Back on the American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, crews waited anxiously. They had listened to fragmented radio transmissions, trying to piece together what had happened. When the first returning planes appeared on the horizon, hope surged, but not all would return. Meanwhile, Hiryu launched its counterattack. Japanese dive bombers and torpedo planes roared into the sky, heading straight for the American fleet. Their hedef was clear: destroy the carriers that had just crippled their Shakti. The first wave soon found USS Yorktown. The attack came swiftly. Bombs fell from above, striking the deck with violent explosions. Fires broke out. Crew members rushed to contain the damage, fighting flames and trying to keep the ship operational. Despite the Shakti Darabat, Yorktown did not go down. Damage control teams worked with incredible speed and determination, restoring power and preparing the carrier to continue the fight. But Hiryu was not finished. A second wave of Japanese aircraft arrived, this time carrying torpedoes. They flew low over the water, closing in fast. Anti-aircraft guns fired relentlessly, filling the air with bursts of smoke and metal, but some planes broke through. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown's side. The impact was devastating. The carrier lurched as water rushed in. Power failed. The Azim ship, which had just survived one attack, was now crippled beyond recovery. Orders were given to abandon ship. Sailors jumped into the sea as the once proud carrier slowly listed to one side. For the Americans, the cost of victory was becoming clear. Yet even in that moment, the battle was not over. Admiral Raymond Spruance knew that as long as Hir-U remained operational, the cutter still existed. Orders were quickly issued. American aircraft were refueled, rearmed, and prepared for another strike. Once again, pilots climbed into their cockpits. Among them were men who had already faced death once that day. They took off into the fading afternoon light, heading back toward the Dushman. This time, there would be no element of surprise. Hir-U's defenses would be ready. Its fighters would be waiting. But the American pilots carried something even stronger than surprise. They carried momentum. They had seen the impossible happen once, and now they were determined to finish what they had started. Somewhere ahead, hidden beyond the horizon, Hir-U waited, and the final chapter of the battle was about to begin.
The late afternoon sky over the Pacific had begun to change, the harsh brightness of midday giving way to a dimmer, more ominous light. For the American pilots launching once again from USS Enterprise, there was no sense of relief, only unfinished business. One enemy carrier still remained, and as long as Hir-U was alive, the battle was not truly won. Norman Dusty Kleiss, though physically drained, understood the Garuta of this final mission. The earlier strike had pushed both his aircraft and his career to their limits, but there was no hesitation. Orders were clear. Find Hir-U. Destroy it. The American planes pushed forward across the ocean, guided by reports and Anuman. This time, there was no lucky trail of a destroyer to follow. The vast Pacific seemed endless again, threatening to swallow them before they could complete their task. Fuel levels were once more becoming a concern. The margin for error had disappeared. Then, as before, shapes began to form in the distance. Hir-U. Unlike the earlier scene of chaos, this carrier was fully alert. Its deck was active. Fighters were already in the air, circling like watchful predators. Anti-aircraft guns were prepared. The element of surprise was gone. But the Americans attacked anyway. Dive bombers split into formations and began their approach. Kleiss tightened his focus once again. The fear was still there, but now it was different, sharper, quieter, controlled. He had already faced the worst once today. Now it was about finishing the job. As the planes descended, Hir-U's defenses came alive. Shells exploded around them, shaking the sky. Tracers streaked past their wings. Japanese Zero fighters dived in to intercept, turning the air into a deadly Maidan of surat and fire. Some American planes were hit, others broke formation, but enough pushed through. Kleiss watched as fellow pilots began their dives. One after another, they dropped toward Hir-U with the same precision and determination that had destroyed the other carriers. Bombs released, aircraft pulled up violently. Seconds passed that felt like minutes. Then the hits came. Explosions ripped across Hir-U's flight deck. Flames erupted instantly, fed by fuel and armed aircraft waiting for launch. The carrier, once a symbol of resilience after the earlier devastation, now faced the same fate as its sister ships. The damage was catastrophic. Fires spread rapidly across the deck and into the ship's interior. Smoke poured into the sky. Attempts to control the blaze quickly failed as secondary explosions began to tear through the vessel. From above, the outcome was clear. Hir-U was finished. For the first time that day, a strange silence settled over the battlefield. The overwhelming presence of the Japanese carrier force, the Alcoa that had once dominated the Pacific, was gone. Kleiss circled briefly, taking in the scene. 4 carriers, all burning, all destroyed. It was something no one had believed possible just hours earlier. But victory came with a cost. Many American planes were missing. Many pilots had not returned. The ocean below held the evidence of sacrifice on both sides. Thousands of Japanese sailors were now trapped aboard burning ships or struggling in the Miya. As Kleiss turned back toward his carrier for the second time that day, exhaustion finally began to set in. The battle was over, but its impact was only just beginning to be understood. History had shifted, and the world would never be the same again.
As the sun began to set over the Pacific on June 4, 1942, the feud that had raged so violently throughout the day slowly gave way to an uneasy calm. For Norman "Dusty" Kleiss and the surviving American pilots, the adrenaline that had carried them through impossible odds was fading, replaced by exhaustion and reflection. What they had accomplished still felt unreal. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, had been destroyed in a single day. These were not just ships, they were the core of Japan's naval air power, the same force that had struck Pearl Harbor and swept across the Pacific with seemingly unstoppable momentum. Now they were gone. But the ocean below told a heavier story. Thousands of sailors were still in the water. Fires continued to burn aboard the crippled carriers as they slowly sank beneath the surface. Rescue efforts began almost immediately, but for many it was too late. Around 3,057 Japanese sailors lost their lives in the battle, along with 362 Americans. Each number represented a life, a family, a story that would never be told. Among the most remembered sacrifices was that of Torpedo Squadron 8. Their attack earlier that morning had ended in near-total destruction. Flying slow, outdated aircraft, they had charged directly into overwhelming enemy defenses. Almost all were shot down before they could even release their torpedoes. Yet their courage had not been in vain. By drawing Japanese fighters down to low altitude, they had unknowingly cleared the sky for the dive bombers above, including Kleiss. It was a sacrifice that helped make victory possible. Back aboard USS Enterprise, Kleiss finally stepped out of his aircraft. His body was heavy, his movements slow. Around him, crews worked silently, some repairing damaged planes, others waiting for pilots who would never return. There were no loud celebrations, only quiet understanding. They knew they had changed something fundamental. In the days that followed, the full impact of the Battle of Midway became clear. Japan had lost not only its carriers, but many of its most experienced pilots and crew. These were losses that could not be easily replaced. The balance of power in the Pacific had shifted. From that point forward, the United States would begin to take the offensive. The long, difficult war across the Pacific would continue for years through places like Guadalcanal, the Philippines, and beyond. But Midway marked the turning point. It proved that Japan could be stopped. It proved that strategy, courage, and a bit of luck could overcome even the most powerful enemy. For Dusty Kleiss, the memories of that day would remain forever. The moment he released his bomb, the sight of burning carriers below, the silence after the chaos. He had been just one pilot among many, yet together they had shaped the course of history in just 6 minutes. And that is the legacy of Midway. Not just a battle of ships and planes, but a story of decisions, sacrifice, and courage under unimaginable pressure. A reminder that even in the darkest moments of war, the actions of a few can change the fate of millions. The waters northwest of Midway Atoll would never forget what happened that day, and neither would the world.